Welcome to Film Strip. These podcasts are spoiler-filled as we discuss the plots, characters, and themes of the films in review. All content used or discussed in these podcast episodes is the property of the respective owners and used under the Fair Use Act, Section 504, C2, Title 17.
Welcome to Film Strip. I'm Jay.
I'm Lindsey.
I'm Ron.
We're here to review Manhunter, starring William Peterson, Kim Greist, Joan Allen, Brian Cox, Dennis Farina, Stephen Lang, and Tom Noonan. Based on the novel Red Dragon by Thomas Harris and directed by Michael Mann, released in 1986 on a $15 million budget, grossed $8.5 million plus when it was in the theaters. Didn't really make a splash, not a lot of critical acclaim, but it did introduce the world to Hannibal Lecter. And 5 years later, that would be an iconic moment for Anthony Hopkins and horror movies and all the like as we would get into that. But why are we talking about Manhunter? Well, because it is 2021 and this is this movie's 35th anniversary. And in the 35 years since it was released, it's another one of the many films that I think Film Twitter and other places have gone to reevaluate and have more thoughts about. And I certainly have a lot of strong thoughts about it, but I wanted to talk about it with you two and really get a sense of what it was. And Lindsey, let's start with you. Like, ever seen this before? And then like Hannibal Lecter's whole oeuvre as a general concept.
Yeah, so I have seen the Anthony Hopkins version of Hannibal Lecter. This is the first time I ever saw this movie. The first time I even heard of it, Jay, was when you said, hey, we're going to review Manhunter. Have you ever seen it? And I said, no. And you said, perfect. So this was my first introduction to it.
Oh,
so thank you.
Perfect. Oh, well, I don't know if you'll be thanking me after we get through it or not, but we'll see.
I weirdly don't have much of a history with this movie or with Hannibal Lecter. I've seen all the movies. I've seen this. I've seen all the other movies. I saw, and I think I actually reviewed the young Hannibal Lecter movie that came out a few years ago. I think I wrote that up on Den of Geek. And I am a big fan of the Hannibal TV series that was on NBC, which was amazing and took a lot. It felt like it took a lot stylistically from this one, but just with less dark lighting and more like bright lighting.
Yeah, that Hannibal series, just to get out of the way real quick, with Hugh Dancy and Mads Mikkelsen and Larry Fishburne and a host of other great actors, is the superior version of telling this story as it's been turned from book to screen. And I'll just go ahead and spoil that and say now this third season is pretty much the Red Dragon arc, though they change a good bit at the end, but it fits with that series. If you've never watched that series, watch it. And you watch it on Prime and you think like, okay, it's no big deal, but think that was on NBC, and the amount of gore they get away with on cable television is pretty impressive, considering they killed it after 3 seasons. But, we're here to talk about this one. I was not aware that this existed until I was in college. And I think it was one of those early IMDb things. Like, I was a big fan of Silence of the Lambs. I think just starting high school when that came out, but my whole family went and saw that in the theaters because we'd heard about it. And I read the book afterward. I mean, I thought that was cool. And I remember a friend of mine in high school read a lot of Thomas Harris stuff, and he read Red Dragon, and he said, yeah, you should check it out. They made a movie out of it, but it sucks. And that's all he ever said about it. And I was like, okay. And this was, years before they did it again. And so I read, Silence of the Lambs and Hannibal and all that kind of stuff. And, maybe someday we'll get around to some of those, so I won't tell all my thoughts on them, but they're different pieces of work. But even as just a book, though, Red Dragon's always been one of those that I say like, well, this is a prime example of a really interesting story in a book that doesn't quite get its justice when you put it on the screen. And I used to say that up until they did that third season of that Hannibal show, which is pretty good and pretty faithful to it, lifting a lot of direct dialogue out. But I found this in college because I was a Michael Mann fan. I'm still a Michael Mann fan. He kind of got me really turned on to all of his stuff. And so I was going back and someone said, you got to watch Manhunter. And I found it in the video rental for 99 cents or whatever at the movie gallery or whatever existed at the time, kids. And I rented that sucker and watched it. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. And, that's kind of all I thought about it. I remember Tom Noonan was, the bad guy in Last Action Hero and many other creepy things. And Joan Allen I'd seen do like serious work. And stuff. And Dennis Farina is, one of my favorite ex-cops turned actor, and he's also awesome. But William Peterson to me was just a blank. I was like, okay. And this was before he was CSI and all that action. So I saw this, didn't really think much about it, watched it again several years later. And this may be the third or fourth time I've actually sat and made myself sit through it the whole time. I mean, it's been on, it's on AMC sometimes and stuff like that, or HBO or whatever. And I'll watch a piece or two of it. But I think the telling part was I tried to get Rachel to watch it with my wife. And about 12 minutes into it, she's like, this kind of sucks. I think I'm going to watch something else. And so she was not a fan of this, but I'll reserve my full review till we get into it. But yeah, either of you watched this with a significant other?
Yes, I did. And it was very entertaining to hear the color commentary on this as well, because I had no idea what I was walking into. Jay, I believe your description of this to me was, quote, an indie Miami Vice version of Hannibal Lecter. So when I heard that, it made it sound way cooler than it actually was. And that's why Brian and I were both like, okay, we're in. Yeah, we're going to watch it. We'll make dinner. We'll watch it. And the whole time. And then it just became like a fun, riffing off of each other the whole time. So I have a few quotes from both of us.
You should have recorded it. You could have your own riff tracks.
This. I know. I didn't think, but maybe next time.
I did not. I literally got done watching it again, 5 minutes before I sat down to record. So, because that's how I roll.
Hey, no, there's nothing wrong with that, because this movie has this great ability to erase itself as you're watching it. It's amazing how much you can sort of remember of it, but how much it's just every time I watch it, it's like a blank. And I don't think I'm too far off that it is kind of Miami Vice and sort of street. And I want to say $15 million in 1986 for a cop thriller horror movie was a lot of money. They didn't pour that kind of money in all them friggin' Jason sequels at the time. And I mean, it showed, but they all made, more money on the back end of that than this did. I find it funny. The funniest story about this in the background is Dino De Laurentiis is really the production end behind the entire Hannibal Lecter series and a lot of Thomas Harris novels anyway, because he's a big Thomas Harris mark. Or was. And I've always considered Dino De Laurentiis, Ron, to be kind of like a more high-class Golan Globus, but missing the mark in a lot of ways. And they changed the name of this at the last minute from Red Dragon, which is what the book is, and it's all referenced in it, to this because they had done a movie called Year of the Dragon that was a huge failure. And he thought, well, people just won't go to a movie called Dragon, so we have to change that now. It sounds ridiculous, but it's also the kind of thing you can believe coming from a studio head.
That is really a top-notch Dino De Laurentiis thought process. You really nailed it on the head when you said that he is the high-class Golan and Globus, because this is 100% a very expensive B movie through and through.
And to be fair to the book too, and having read it, and it's been a while, but I remember it pretty well. It's a pulp thriller. I mean, Thomas Harris writes pulp thrillers. If you ever want to have real fun, go back to the 70s and watch a movie called Black Sunday, which is sort of a precursor to Tom Clancy's Sum of All Fears, where somebody tries to blow the Super Bowl up with a blimp. And it's pretty intense, but the book is really good as those airport kind of paperback novel. I happened to grab that one once at doing one of those holiday times when everybody's going to sit around the living room and stare at each other for no reason at all, and you just need something else to do. And it was before I had a smartphone, so I chewed through that book one holiday many moons ago. But yeah, this one sort of works along the same lines too. It's in the same vein. Either of you have ever read the book before?
No, and I wish I had known that it was a book beforehand. I probably would have delved into it, but I've already made myself the note to go back and read it.
I think I've read more Charlene Harris than I have Thomas Harris.
Well, on that note, I think I'll give us a quick plot summary, and then we can get into this movie, as it were. Will Graham, played by William Peterson, is a retired FBI profiler dragged back into action by his mentor, Jack Crawford, played by the awesome Dennis Farina, to investigate a serial killer who's wiped out a couple of families during the last two lunar cycles. Crawford hopes Graham's abilities to get inside the head of criminals he is chasing will unlock clues the FBI needs to stop the killer before he strikes again. Graham retired after he was working on a case with Dr. Hannibal Lecter, a brilliant but psychotic psychiatrist who nearly killed Graham in the process during his capture. Graham, struggling to find a lead, visits the now in prison Lecter for help, but is clearly weary of too much contact with his old frenemy, whatever we want to call that. Meanwhile, the killer, Francis Dollarhide, also known as the Tooth Fairy in the press, is choosing his next victims using his day job managing a film developing company where they compile home movies, and that's how he scouts out their homes. The FBI intercepts communication between Dollarhide and Lecter and attempts to draw the killer out, but this fails badly, and Graham's family is even targeted. But Dollarhide ignores the shot at Graham's family and instead decides to take out a tabloid journalist, biting off his lips and setting him on fire. Francis was also dating a coworker, Reba, who is blind, and while they have a passionate affair, one that even involves tigers, it's not enough. And unable to control his bloodlust any longer, Dollarhide kidnaps Reba, takes her to his home, and just as he's about to kill her, Graham and the cops intervene, and in a big shootout set to Inagata de Vita, Graham is able to kill Dollarhide, but not before sustaining injuries to his face and having a refrigerator fall on him. Graham returns to his family in Florida, once again wearing incredible short shorts as credits roll and Don Johnson music plays. And that is the most 80s way I can describe the movie known as Manhunter.
That description is way more straightforward than the movie would lead you to believe.
Well, that's also probably true. I think part of it is knowing the book and having seen this, and then also seeing the Red Dragon version that Brett Ratner made in the 2000s, and then having seen the Hannibal series. It's just a story I feel like I know, because the beats they don't ever change them. It's just the same thing. It's like Kiss live albums, like it's the same songs, they're just slightly produced differently. And that's what this is. And I guess the way to dive into this, because again, all this weaves in and out, and I want to ask just something from the top. The thing that's always struck me about this story in this movie is that the killer is not a mystery. It's not a wait until we find him. I mean, he doesn't show up until an hour into the movie on the screen, but the fact that they blow who that is and then spend a whole act setting him up for you. What did y'all think of that? Because that's not the usual motif for these kind of things.
It feels like the kind of thing that you would get later on in Michael Mann's film career, like when they get around to Heat, because he, throughout his writing, he has always sought to be very authentic and to tell things from both the cop side point of view and the criminal side point of view. Specifically, when he was doing Crime Story, he worked with real cops and he worked with real undercover agents who dealt with real criminals. So he's always kind of reached for that balance in the story, that kind of cat and mouse sort of feel, where you've got, the killer acting unfettered, and then people trying to pursue the killer as we watch. It kind of sets a little bit of dramatic irony up, because we know who the killer is, we know what they're doing, we know what their next move is going to be, but we get to watch the cops who don't know this act on clues and kind of put things together. So for me, I think it's a cool touch.
Yeah, I appreciated it. I think honestly, like at the beginning, because as you mentioned, Jay, we don't see the killer until about an hour into it. But when Graham started having those weird monologues with himself and at the television, I was like, oh, he's the killer. He's just insane. And then very shortly after, we saw the killer, and I said, I take it back. I was wrong. But now I see where this movie is going. So it was easy to backtrack a little earlier on. But right off the bat, I was like, oh, Graham's the insane one. I can see it. We're seeing like a Fight Club double, schizophrenic situation here. But it was a little more simplistic than that.
Well, you're not far off from it, though, because that's definitely what Thomas Harris writes about in the book. And honestly, the way this unfolds, that is Michael Mann doing that, because in the book, you get Dollarhide early. Like, we always know who he is. And it's like Ron said, we get to watch the cops try to pick up the pieces we already know and watch them do it wrong and then get it right. And there's a lot of authenticity to that. And this is something that you see in Michael Mann films forever. It was in Thief. You mentioned Crime Story. That's where he met Dennis Farina, actually, that's not a joke. He was a 20-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department before he got into acting and stuff. And he got all these guys to tell him and feed him these stories. And so there's Thief, there's Heat, even Last of the Mohicans, Collateral, and even something like Public Enemies, which is, based on a true story and stuff. Michael Mann is obsessed with the idea that these men that chase each other, whether they're killers or cops, are the same people. They're just on different sides of the fence, and this movie, in particular, this character and the way Thomas Harris wrote it, is that Will Graham is a sociopath. He just knows enough about that and has enough moral tendency to say, well, I'm going to use my powers for good instead of to, whack families in Birmingham and Atlanta. I mean, that's the secret of Will Graham, is that he is a crazy person and he is a psychotic, but that's how he thinks like them. And that's also what has kind of driven him to run to Florida and do the things that he's done.
To me, that's a really interesting dichotomy, because you see a lot of similar techniques as Dollarhide is basically investigating these people to learn the best way to break in and do his thing. He has it scouted out. He covers every angle. He figures out what he's going to need well ahead of time and has it ready. And you see a lot of that attention to detail also reflected in how Will Graham and the FBI go about tracking him. It's that same obsessiveness about minutia, the same little details, the same thing. There's a little bit of talcum powder there. He took his glove off. We better swab this body for prints. Check the eyeballs because he's got a weird thing about mirrors. It's obsessive meeting obsessive.
Yeah, and I think we see that we see this like whole dichotomy yin yang thing too from the very beginning. And I remember thinking like, this is absolutely intentional the way it's set up. And it's one of the first scenes where Graham and Crawford are sitting on the beach, and they're very clearly in this placement where they're facing opposite directions. Crawford is in a suit. Graham is in, probably 3-day-old shorts and a t-shirt, and they look very different. And it looks like a yin yang symbol almost. And so it's very clearly, it looks like it is intentionally trying to show like how different the two of them are and still working together from the very get-go.
Lindsey, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I just watching it this time, I caught onto something that I think Michael Mann is doing with that scene. Is Crawford is facing the ocean, the deep end, and Will Graham is facing his family, the land. And Crawford is literally trying to drag him back off the deep end to do this again. And, Michael Mann is not one for wasted dialogue. And I appreciate the soundscape and kind of the quietness that scene has. And, it's not something the entire movie carries, but it's just in some of those introductory things. A lot of times you watch Mann movies, that's kind of how you start with a character. Like I think in Heat, you see Robert De Niro like walk through 5 places and steal 6 cars. And he never says a word, but everything you need to know about him just by watching him move. And so it's a lot of that same stuff. So, but yeah, I think the thing to take away is that Graham and Dollarhide are the same side of the coin. And it's not the first time Graham's felt like that. And it's why he's so scared to sort of turn this on. Before we get into picking at the movie, because I do have lots of nits to pick, and I'm sure you all do too. I want to say that one thing I will appreciate about this movie in all of its versions, and it's in the book too, is how much like real, actual FBI police type work they show people doing, and that it's not just one guy. It's a table full of people, and there's the guy from Knots Landing is the handwriting expert, and there's Chris what's his name from Cabin Boy is some other kind of expert, and all this. You've got all these people, their faces from stuff, and I love that they show that it's never just one cop; it's a team of cops that get all this kind of stuff done.
Wait, was that really Chris Elliott?
That's a very young Chris Elliott. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. Thank you for the last name. I could not remember, but yeah, that's Chris Elliott. Yep.
That's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
I do like that touch because when I was in high school, they had this thing called the Explorers Program, which you may or may not have heard of. But my Explorer
We had that
program,
in mind too.
did you partake?
I did 1 year.
I did a year as well, and our local Explorer thing was at the FBI. So we went into the FBI headquarters. We met with an FBI agent. We did all kinds of cool stuff, talking about crimes, and it was a really good time. But one of the things that he emphasized is that you are putting pieces together. Other people are putting the pieces together for you. So like we had our agent who was our Explorers post leader, and he was great. But every time we were going to do a thing like handwriting analysis or fingerprinting or sweep and clear operations, like in a dark room, he would bring in someone like, this is the thing I do. Here, we're all going to do this together. Check this out. This is the thing I do. They literally pay me to sit here and do fingerprint lifting all day, and I run it through the computer, and it was really cool. But it's good to see that this is reflected in like it makes total sense to me that this is reflected in how Michael Mann's going to construct these scenes, because he's nothing if not like Captain Attention to Detail.
Yeah, completely. I mean, that's what makes it, at least in my end, that's the interesting part of the movie, when they're unraveling all the knots and they're trying to figure out. And any of these movies, these procedural kind of things, I mean, that's kind of the joke about Law and Order, is that if you actually pay attention to the cut scenes, like the cut, black screens in between Law and Order, you'll realize the amount of dates that they cover on a case and that they overlap all the time. And it's trial part 45, and you only see the little snip. And that's supposed to be Dick Wolf saying, hey, I'm just showing you what you need to know to fit in this 48-minute window. But it's a lot more than that, even though it is the trope of how fast you can solve a crime in an hour, right? But if you pay attention to it, it's over a lot of time. But I love the fact that you have all these experts, and the fact that this movie is so dated in the 80s, and the book was written in the late 70s, early 80s. So like they're talking about half-inch VHS tape, and I got to run it through my book of fingerprints, which means like putting up laminated sheets so you can look at it on a screen. I mean, it is not nearly as sophisticated as what we have today, or even what we would have 10 years from this time. But oddly enough, it doesn't totally outdate the movie. Like, I kind of have to remember, like, oh yeah, nobody has a cell phone in 1986, or at least not in this setting of this movie. It's all, done with pictures and file folders and stuff like that.
And the Filofax.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah. Rolodex and
the VTR. At one point they call it a videotape recorder, which just made me laugh.
Wow. Yeah. So, well, let's talk about our characters here a little bit, though, because I think this is where the nits will come out. William Peterson, can we all just agree he kind of sucks? I mean, no offense to the guy, he's had a great career, but he is so blank and weirdly intense at the wrong time. Like, I don't get what this performance is all about.
And William Peterson was Graham, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Just making sure. Yeah. I will say, yes, very blank. His bow-leggedness was so distracting. That's one of my main, that is, I mean, among many, but that's a big issue for me, I think, is that there are at least 3 scenes that I can think of where he was just, I mean, the legs were just like an O when he was walking, especially because it's a beautiful shot. And one of the few that I really, truly liked in the film was they're like coming through like an alley or an overpass, and it's like blues and blacks, and it's like that quintessential detective shot, right, of this guy walking through this tunnel. And then you just see his bow legs. I was like, what does this guy do? Is he a horseback rider for a living? Is he a cowboy?
He did go to Idaho State. So, I mean, he's from Chicago, though. So, yeah.
It was to the point it became distracting for me.
Yeah. I'll tell you what was distracting for me, and you hit on one of the things, Lindsey, when he's having those conversations with himself. And I know what it is he's trying to get in his head, but the energy is so off. It's like, you had to touch her, didn't you? It's like Vince McMahon or something.
I know. Yeah. It is off because it's flat. Like he has one tone and one volume throughout most of his monologues.
No, see, I had the exact opposite take on all that because I thought all of his weirdness worked well because he's supposed to be a weird, crazy man who gets lost in the heads of these serial killers and who doesn't seem to have much of a connection to reality outside of the work because, he's got a wife and child, but they don't exactly he doesn't seem to be like an everyday, he doesn't seem to be an everyday presence in the life of his family. He seems like he's physically there, but mentally he is not home.
Well, and I don't know that it's expressly said in this version. It's definitely in the book and it's in the other versions of this. That's not his son. That's his wife and that's her son. And he's stepdad. And so as far as the kid's concerned, that's dad. But there's this whole bit in the book about where like Hannibal Lecter tells him like, that was smart of you. You kind of made an instant family because, you can't breed your own crazy genes again and all this stuff. Like there's a lot of that back and forth and Graham doesn't exactly disagree with it. But I think there's a scene where like they're buying groceries when they're at the Hideaway house or whatever. And the kid's trying to relate to him and he's trying to tell him, I thought bad things, really awful things. And then I didn't think them anymore. Yes, I like Folgers. I mean, it's just so stilted. And yeah, but okay, so you're saying the weirdness worked for you, huh?
Yeah, the weirdness of his whole performance worked for me because it was, I mean, he's got to match energy and weirdness with Tom Noonan because he's trying to get in the head of Dollar Hyde.
That's true.
And that's a formidable task for any performer to try to be as weird as Tom Noonan. And yet, I think William Peterson is more than up to the task of being unsettling.
So outside of his bow legs and his weird fashion, Lindsey, what did you make out of his performance? Because that is good to notice because I noticed it too. I was like, I don't know what football injury this guy had before he started acting, but holy cow.
I see where you're going with this, Ron, and I like it. And I'm almost convinced. I think for me, as a director or as an actor, I would have taken it a step further so that it was very clearly a choice, like an acting choice of I am this way because this is the character and this is what I'd like. For me, it wasn't big enough to convince me that he was doing it intentionally and not just bad acting.
I'll say Hugh Dancy in the Hannibal show gets everything that Ron's talking about here as being that just offbeat weirdo. And I think he just can kind of play those characters anyway. He's everything I've ever seen him in. That's pretty much what he's done. And I think he just gets it or whatever. Edward Norton famously in Red Dragon said, I did this for the paycheck. I don't care. So, and Brett Ratner was directing him. So come on, like there was no direction. So that is what it is. I wanted to review 3 movies at once, but what y'all are talking about is that's a character trait. What I'm saying is for me is Peterson almost gets there. And then for whatever reason, he veers into what would have been like early Lifetime style acting. And it just becomes too much. And I think,
we call that bag of tricks.
Thank you.
In the acting industry. It's just like you're leaning on the things that works, but are not necessarily nuanced for a particular character. And so his delivery of the lines that were written were fine, but they could have been better.
His whole relationship with his wife is really very
weird.
Late 80s, right? Yeah. Kim Greist gets nothing to do with this movie, and she's a good actress. They fixed that with Mary Louise Parker in Red Dragon. I'll say that. She's given a lot more to do. And in the book, the Molly character has a lot more to say and do. This woman's job seemed to be lay around half naked most of the time and stare longingly at William Peterson in the dark. Like that's all they gave her to do. And I felt bad for her at some point. I'm like, she should have a little bit more say, stake something in this. Like their conversations are so stilted and weird. It's almost like this is where George Lucas learned how to write romance too. And Michael Mann sucks at this too. It's the worst parts of Heat. It's all the romantic stuff between Amy Brenneman and Robert De Niro. Like there's no chemistry, and it's not on the page, and it's not between the people. And there's just something oddly strange about the way that these two actors sort of crawled all over each other half the time.
Well, I mean, this is really early in William Peterson's career. And this is like his first actual like role. I think his debut was in like To Live and Die in L.A. and he played a bit part thief, and he was on one of Michael Mann's episodes of Twilight Zone. So he's definitely like finding his way, I guess, as a performer. But I also feel like a lot of the romantic subplot and the relationship stuff in Michael Mann's works are perfunctory because that's not what he's interested in. But
Agreed.
There's some sort of pressure. I guarantee you Dino De Laurentiis was like, need more blue light.
More half woman, yes.
Yes, put the woman in bed, blue light, lots of white, everyone like. When my Hannibal Lecter die, everybody cry.
My friend Menahem say more blue light and half naked woman work. So,
well, here's the thing. This is fairly early directorially Michael Mann as well, because like he'd done Thief, and he is hot in the middle of like he just got done with Police Story, and he's in the middle of Miami Vice.
Yep.
And when he shoots this movie, so like this $15 million budget, they were thinking, oh, this is going to be a huge hit because Miami Vice was the biggest show on TV. Mm-hmm. I mean, the debut of Police Story was watched by 30 million people.
Yeah. No, there was there's all the reason to think this would work, but for whatever reason, it just doesn't.
And I think a lot of that is because it's not cool. There's not the cool that you get from Miami Vice. It looks cool. I think Manhunter looks great. I love the weird lighting choices. I love the fact that it's Florida or in the deep South in the summer and it's always raining.
Credit where it's due though. Dante Spinati is one of the classic cinematographers of the 80s and 90s, and he worked with Mann and Curtis Hanson and all these guys for years, and Brett Ratner. But I mean, he shoots really interesting, good-looking stuff. So, but more beyond the way it looks, the two characters, unless you told me they were married to each other, I would just think they were like randomly hooking up at hotels because like they have nothing. There's no marriage there that I see. I don't know. Lindsay, tell me if I'm wrong.
No, you're not wrong. I also didn't find their relationship or lack thereof particularly off-putting because it wasn't a major plot point for me. And if anything, like it probably at least saved that bit of the movie for me. Like one of my biggest pet peeves is a love story in the middle of something where it shouldn't be or clearly doesn't belong. It doesn't move the plot forward. It effectively has no purpose for character development and so on and so forth. And I don't know if that, unless it were to make Graham seem more personable. And honestly, in this case, I think it served its purpose as making Graham seem less personable and more of a sociopath. So maybe in that sense, that's why it worked for me. But I didn't find it off-putting, the lack thereof.
I didn't need it to be huge. I'm just saying, like, and I know what they're doing because we're going to get to the Dollarhide Reba thing in a minute. And these are, again, the yin and yang to each other. And we're supposed to be watching this. And you see Graham is sort of actively being dispassionate about his life and about his, family and all this stuff. And that's very different because you see Dollarhide has to make that choice eventually too. Like that's how he kills these people and all this stuff. And I don't know, it's just weird. But again, it is sort of an offshoot to what's actually supposed to be going on in the movie, which is in between all his police work and whatnot. Which I don't know. I felt bad for Kim Grice too as an actress. I saw in a lot of things for several decades. I feel like she got nothing to do. William Peterson is though you're right, Ron. He's early in his career and he is proto David Caruso, and I mean that in all the ways that Caruso does things on NYPD Blue and CSI and the couple of bad movies he tried to make. There's just something about those two guys that they fit in that window.
I will not let you slander Session 9.
Another day, as we say here. But yeah, so it's a good time to kind of flip over and talk about Dollarhide now, Francis Dollarhide. You've already mentioned the weirdness that is Tom Noonan, Ron. We talked about him years ago on House of the Devil, and someday we'll get around to Last Action Hero. It's been on the list at Film Strip for probably a decade, but he's always a strange, off-putting presence. He's super tall, he's weirdly lanky, and he doesn't mind just sort of being the librarian that secretly thinks about slicing your throat and drinking your blood. That's sort of Tom Noonan in a nutshell.
He studied a lot of serial killers early on to try to get his head into the role. And he's based off a serial killer or a murderer that Michael Mann spent years being a pen pal with. That's where the In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida thing comes from.
I did not know that. That's an interesting note because I had thoughts about that.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah. Wow. What's the story then on In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida? Like serial killer love it or something?
Yeah. So this guy, Dennis Wayne Wallace, had been obsessed with this woman he didn't know, and he ended up murdering people because of it. I don't remember if he murdered her or not, but his song with the woman he was obsessed with was In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida.
Wow. So
Michael Mann was like, that's a long song and it sounds creepy. I can definitely set a terrorizing scene to this. Let's do it.
Yeah. 60s prog acid rock. Yeah. Like that. You can pretty well do anything weird to that on screen that you want to. Iron Butterfly. That introduced a whole new group to it. Well, honestly, I knew that song only because that's the weird music my dad would listen to sometimes. But when I saw that in this movie, I was like, oh yeah, that song. That's creepy and strange, just like the rest of this flick. Speaking of creepy and strange, Tom Noonan does excel at that, and he nailed that out of the park.
He did. Jay, I have a question, or Ron, because there might be something about this in the book. There was a line in the movie where he was talking to Reba, I believe, and she said to him that he spoke very well, which implied that there's some reason he shouldn't be well spoken. Did I read that correctly? And do you have any more information on that?
Yeah, there's a little bit of makeup job on Noonan. You can see he's had like a cleft palate work done.
Yeah.
And there's that. And so she's trying to disarm him from how he's hiding behind his, stuff or whatever, the things that he's gone through. Yeah.
That's one of the reasons why his main motivating factor. He does play
a creepy guy very well.
That's one of the reasons why his main motivating factor is that he's looking for acceptance, because I would imagine that having a facial scar and a speech impediment and looking like Tom Noonan does not make you incredibly popular with friends and peers.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I will ding the Red Dragon movie for, is they cast friggin' Ray Fiennes to play this. And that's a gorgeous man no matter what you do to him. You cut his nose off for 5 movies in Harry Potter and he's still good looking. So that was a mistake. Tom Noonan's much more the right energy for this, and it's much more like the Dollarhide in the book. He's tall, he's weird, you wouldn't miss him if you saw him, but you would also pay no mind to him because he just slinks in the shadows. And that's one of the cool things about the character. And I think they nail it with this. And I'll give Noonan a lot of credit, where I think Peterson is kind of overdriving his strangeness to try to make that point. Noonan is just being what we've kind of come for him to be, but he's just very unassuming. And that's one of the scary things about serial killers. If you read anything about any of them, is a lot of times they're just unassuming, normal people. And Thomas Harris has said that this serial killer was based on BTK, who at the time they didn't know who that was when he wrote this, but they just assumed it was somebody who disappeared in the shadows. And for a long time, he did.
The disappearing into the shadows is a very accurate description of BTK.
Yeah, very much. And then you get Reba, played by the venerable Joan Allen. I've again, like Joan Allen and so many other things, I don't really associate her with this kind of stuff because it's not really her forte. But I thought she did a really good job of playing this incredibly confident, very secure person who is not limited by her disability. The fact that she doesn't have sight, she's still very good at what she does. They even give her the detail of the Braille watch, which I think is neat. I honestly, it's one of the better, like her and Dennis Farina as Crawford are two of the better performances, and they're on the periphery of this movie. But so much of what she does, particularly opposite of Tom Noonan, drives the second act of this movie forward. Because I'll be honest with you, if that second act, it is such a weird veer off to like, let's take the romantic subplot of the serial killer now. That shouldn't work, but it totally does.
There were a few big moments that worked for me in this film. And I know you mentioned the tiger scene. And when I saw that,
yeah,
my first reaction was, this is the first moment so far in this movie where I'm like, okay, this is the first scene that I'm into. I'm really digging because I see where they're going with it. Dollarhide, like you see his humanity. I also think it's really interesting that he's obsessed with these mirrors and how he's seen by other people, and he ends up falling for this woman who's blind, which is a little tongue in cheek, but also kind of nice. And he takes her to this place where he knows that she'll have this once in a lifetime experience. And I don't know, it was so sweet. I just really like that scene.
It's him at that moment though, because at any other time, if you lock that little blonde woman in a cage with a tiger, she's gonna get mauled to death.
Right.
Because that's what the tiger knows to do. At any other time, he would kill her just like he would anybody else that he's killed, right? But right now, he's kind of sedated. She's tamed him a little bit, and he's letting her sort of feel that, and he's trying to sort of work through his own stuff. It's one of the things that's missing in this is you don't really know why Dollarhide is the way he is. And the book is much more explicit about it. The other versions of this story spell it all out. I won't blow it here because, again, we'll maybe get around to those one day. But that's one thing I think is missing here is you don't really know what makes him go. Like we know what makes Graham tick because they've laid it all out for us. I have no idea what makes this guy roll. But that scene, it is so weird, but it's also so like, if you want to impress a girl, like you can take her to dinner, maybe dancing, or you can take her to your veterinarian friend and let her pet a friggin' tiger. Like, what do you do on the second date? I don't know.
Well, then you take her to kill Carol Baskin, I guess.
True.
Okay, so you mentioned Joan Allen, and Joan Allen is great. And she did a lot of study to move accurately as a blind person. Like she walked around New York with a mask over her eyes and a cane to learn how to blind walk, which is pretty cool. But let's not act like Joan Allen is above this kind of material. She was in Face Off, Jay.
Okay, you know what? You're right.
She was in Face Off, and she is incredible in Death Race. She is a blast in the Jason Statham 2008 Death Race.
Yeah,
she's so good in that. Just it's kind of playing against the kind of person she would become. Again, this is still very early Joan Allen, but yeah, she's this is, this ain't that far from playing Goody Proctor in The Crucible to me.
Okay, I can see it. And you're right to bring up Face Off. I totally forgot about weirdos running their hands over her face. So she should be used to that at this point because it's happened so many times in her career. But
it's somehow less creepy when it's Tom Noonan.
Right. Who would have thought between Nick Cage, John Travolta, and Tom Noonan, we'd all go, no, Noonan's more real. But he is. And that's what makes their relationship interesting. And like I say, it's a neat diversion in the middle of this movie, and it's played against Graham trying to still keep up with and relate to his wife as she meets him on the road and all this kind of stuff. We haven't talked about it. Stephen Lang has kind of a bit part in this. This is what early roles for somebody, that big poofy hair that he had going. Nowadays, people are get ready to go see him and Don't Breathe 2 if you needed that in your life. But there he is. And, you know, him as the bad guy and monster from Avatar and 100,000 other things, right? But I had forgotten he was in this. And the whole idea of the National Tattler and like the tabloid thing, I'm like, Thomas Harris must believe that like people took the Inquirer seriously the way that they do like in Great Britain, because nobody, like, the fact that the FBI would bother with that is kind of funny to me. Maybe they do, and I'm just wrong about that. But I loved his whole just total sleaze reporter character though, because while I didn't know people exactly like that who were reporters, I also knew people that were just as cunning to get the story, and all they cared about was getting that headline, getting that byline, and getting it done. They didn't care who they stepped on to get there.
You know, I had no idea that was the blind guy from Don't Breathe.
Well, see, now I've revealed something new to you.
I mean, I knew he was kind of unsettling looking and acting, and Freddie Lounce is not a likable character in any version of this story. Especially the TV version, she's they make it a female Freddy there, and she's despicable. Like, she's somehow worse than this guy, and this guy is a scumbag.
Yeah, Philip Seymour Hoffman was an upgrade in Red Dragon for this, because you kind of felt bad for him. But yeah, this is not a sympathetic character, but it's neat to see him though, and the way that he gets kind of put in the middle of this thing. And I want to ask y'all, is this story asking us to root for what happens to him to happen to him? Because he gets terrorized by Dollarhide, gets his face bitten off, and gets set on fire. Like, there's a statement in that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I feel like that's classic, almost classic horror movie, you know, algorithm. You know, you either kill, well, you know, there are certain people you kill first, and no one's, especially from this movie where we're taking it from, I think, Ron, you had mentioned it earlier, and Jay, probably you too, where man likes to tell the story from both sides of the fence. So if he wants you to kind of get behind Dollarhide as well, you're going to have him kill the most hateable character in the film first. I mean, no one was upset by that. Did he die? He didn't die right away, right? He went to the hospital.
Yeah,
he died.
Yeah.
Yeah, he dies later from his injuries, his many injuries.
But when he was captured, I looked at Brian and I was like, I don't think anyone's upset by this right now. Like, you're kind of rooting for it at that point.
Yeah, because what you know about that guy is that he took pictures of Graham in the hospital when
you're on there.
And to say what happened to Graham after his encounter with Lecter, he nearly got disemboweled. So they had this kind of good fake scar on William Peterson's chest the whole movie. But there were pictures of that got, you know, circulated, and this guy wrote a whole expose on it or whatever. So that's why you're supposed to hate him. And that's why when William Peterson, you know, half suplexes him on top of a Chevy Caprice, you're supposed to be okay with that. And yeah, when he goes out that way, that's Thomas Harris, I think, saying that, you know, murder hungry, if it bleeds, it leads press, is a bad thing.
I think you're supposed to be okay with it up until the point after the face biting. I think that when he's being terrorized, it's all good. When he's biting his face, that's kind of like a haha yes moment. And then you get the hard cut to the flaming puppet in the wheelchair careening down the hallway, and it's like, oh wait, that's, you know, we were okay with him dying, but I don't even think he deserved to die like that.
Fun fact, not a puppet, stuntman wrapped in, you know, whatever fire retardant you have to do it. That is a real person that did that.
It looked like a real person, but I was just going to assume there's no way a dude would be like, yeah, I'll sit in a plastic.
Dude, you've seen Halloween too. Dick Warlock walked down a hallway on fire like that, like 4 times in a row.
But there's a difference between walking down a hallway on fire and like riding a flaming chair made of hot plastic.
But you have to admit, that's an evocative scene. Like that strikes that immediately resets, like, oh, I'm supposed to be scared of this now.
Yeah, and that really was a hard cut and very unexpected.
Yeah, that was a legit jump scare, and Michael Mann doesn't do a lot of that kind of thing. So it really worked well, at least for me.
Yeah, no, I admit it's not what you expect. You expect something bad's going to happen to Freddie Lounds. He's basically making him like read the Red Dragon Manifesto or whatever. Like, I have seen the greatness of the, and all that stuff. So you can, because we should say how he gets him too, is that they intercept this communication in the personal ads between Hannibal Lecter and Dollarhide, where they're, I don't know, making out to each other the way serial killers do or whatever, giving weird biblical references that don't make sense, but they're code talking to each other. And the FBI is trying to figure this out. And so Graham comes up with this great idea, like, fine, I'll call up Lowndes and I'll give him the interview he wants, and I'll just trash Dollarhide. I'll talk about how he's going down in flames and he clearly can't get it up and all this stuff, and just insult him. And instead of going after the guy who said it, he goes after the reporter. And that there's something interesting about why that choice is made there.
Why do you think that choice was made, Jay?
I don't know, because it doesn't really flow. Like, that's the part that is cut out of this, that I'll just pick on it now. The whole bit about where Lecter gives him Graham's home address, that pays off in the book and in many other versions of the story. And the fact that Michael Mann decided, no, we're going to cut that out of this, I feel like just totally short shrifts that whole moment. Like, because Hannibal Lecter is trying to kill the guy who put him in jail, even though he has a lot of respect for him, and they're clearly, again, two sides of the same coin. He straight up sets him to get murdered by this random person, and he does not know, that he has no connection to otherwise than just through these random personal ads. And the machinations that he goes through to get to it, I'm like, that all seems like for naught. Like, again, that it bothers me, because I know that it's supposed to pay off, and then they just skip through it and go like, no, we'll just shoot people by a refrigerator instead.
It felt like that subplot you were talking about with him reaching out to him through the paper. Personal ads and the classifieds used to be like the 4chan of every local publication.
That's true.
Like in our local independent newspaper, Leo, there were some terrifying and despicable like ads in the back page, but that's what kept the lights on. But it's interesting because it feels like they took that idea of like him Dr. Lecter using a serial killer as a weapon. They took that basic idea. They're like, oh, let's just do this whole Kevin Bacon show about it, and that's how they made The Following.
Yes, it very much is like The Following. I'm glad you mentioned that, Ron, because I was a fan of that. I know you followed it as well. We talked about it a good bit back in the day, but yeah, it's very much the same kind of idea. So that's a good enough time too to talk about our Hannibal Lecter. We haven't gotten around to him here. Brian Cox doing this, what would become iconic character. I gotta say, the thing about Hannibal Lecter and what made him interesting in Silence of the Lambs is that he's in the movie for 20 minutes. And if there's anything interesting about him here, it's that he's not really a part of the story. He's just on the periphery of it. But unlike poor Graham's wife and some of these other people, at least he has something to do. And I really like him. It's not that I dislike Anthony Hopkins, but I'm like, if he'd been in Silence of the Lambs, it'd have been different energy, but it probably would have still worked. I thought he was good.
I think it's universally accepted that Brian Cox is the best part of this movie. But some of the other people that went out for this were John Lithgow, Mandy Patinkin, Brian Dennehy, and William Friedkin.
Friedkin I can see, because you probably just pull a gun on everybody in real life. Yeah.
And I can see Brian Dennehy like murdering a guy barehanded.
Straight, right?
But I think if you got John Lithgow, the energy would be too similar to Dollarhide, would be too similar to Tom Noonan's energy. I really like Brian Cox, and again, like everyone else, Brian Cox was based his performance off of a real life serial killer from Scotland named Peter Manuel, and kind of took his mannerisms and his way of speaking from that guy. And my favorite part was that he did the audition with his back turned to the casting agents, so they would just pay attention to his voice and his delivery and not look at his face as he's acting, which I think is really a neat thing. And he does have a really cool sounding voice in general, but specifically in this role.
So for me, his voice was fine, but it sounded like a Scottish actor trying to do a British accent. And you could hear it slip and his Scottish accent slip through, which may be a character choice. I didn't realize that he was basing it off of an actual serial killer. So maybe that went into his thought process. As someone who didn't know that, I was just watching it for the first time. That's kind of how it came off. That said, I did like his Hannibal a lot. And one of my favorite moments in the whole movie was when he was on the phone and he's just laying on his bed and his feet are up on the wall. And he just looks like a teenage girl chatting on the phone. And it just served, I just love like that. I don't know. I love how that played off, and I appreciated it very much.
I mean, it's so neat what he does is he has to, he said, I want to talk to my lawyer. They bring him the phone and he uses a gum wrapper and he MacGyvers the phone where he can make a phone call. And all he's trying to do is get Will Graham's home address because he's, posing as some academic research thing. And he just goes, the way he goes through it though, like you say, Lindsey, he's like, he's sitting there chewing that gum like it's no big deal. And he's setting up. It's like, I'm going to have this guy's whole family wiped out by this serial killer who clearly needs me to think for him because he admires me so much. So, okay, fine, I'll do it. And he does it like it's no big deal. Like, they talk about it in Silence of the Lambs, how his heart rate never gets above 85. And I'm like, I can believe it. Like this guy is so twisted that unlike Graham, who gets so wrapped up in all this shit that it just blows his mind, really, Lecter just sort of rolls around like this all day. And it's scary to think about that there's someone out there in the world that exists like that.
But he has a little bit more energy than, say, Anthony Hopkins doing the same role. He feels a bit more like he would be a more capable murderer.
Yeah.
Just from a physical standpoint. Yeah, the guy it's based off of, it's interesting you said, Lindsey, when you talked about the accent, because he was born in America and he lived in New York and Detroit until he was like 6. Then he went back to Scotland, but the part of Scotland he lived in was the Scottish Lowlands, which is on the border with England. So you get kind of a mixed accent. So I think it's very much a specific choice that like Brian Cox is trying to make. Whether you think it's successful or not is another story. It kind of works for me because just based off of the dude whose story it was, it kind of fits that profile.
Figure out his accent. I had to look up the actor and I was like, where is he from? Is this fake? It just feels like it's slipping, but that makes way more sense.
See, I didn't know any of that either. And I've never caught the slip in it too. I thought that was just the idea of Hannibal Lecter's mind is running so far into overdrive at all times that he just gets his words ahead of himself. Sometimes I've seen people do that. And I just thought it was an acting choice because, again, part of that is informed by the fact that I've seen Brian Cox act for 40 years and so many different things. And so I've come to expect it. That's what's neat about going back and watching a movie that's 35 years old that has so many known people in it is you can see either the genesis of what they do or you just see what they are. Like Tom Noonan has played the same character now all these years. And he just keeps doing it and it works. Whereas, and in a lot of ways, William Peterson has too. I think maybe he just dialed the Caruso knob a little bit better as he got older. But yeah, I don't know. I like the Hannibal Lecter here. I like the fact that it's like a little Tabasco sauce. There's just enough in there that I feel it and I know it's in my green beans, but it's not overwhelming what I'm eating.
Yeah, he's got almost this. It's a more playful Hannibal Lecter than like Anthony Hopkins.
Yeah, Anthony Hopkins, I feel like I'm listening to a professor who is also a serial murderer, and there's like an intelligence to it that's good. But Brian Cox, I'm like, I could see this guy being a fast and loose psychiatrist that would hang out with FBI agents and stuff. Yeah. He's writing a few extra scripts for people. Sure.
He's the sort of actor who plays both intelligent and like imposing, because he's a big dude. Like he's a wide man. He's a large man, and he's not like out of shape or anything. He's just physically
like Brian Dennehy was just a wall of a human being, you know. Even in his John Goodman-esque days, he was just still a broad-shouldered big dude.
Yeah, he looks like the kind of dude that when he throws a punch, you feel it, and it doesn't feel good. But
he probably didn't throw more than one because he didn't need it. So.
No, not at his size. But yeah, I think that's an interesting. He does have a really interesting physicality. You're right, Lindsay and Jay, especially with how at ease he is in jail. But it doesn't feel mannered. It feels like, well, this is my life now. But I will make the best of it, and I will, I'll make friends.
Yeah, right. Like he's still, he's talking to the guards, and he does that whole bit too, where you can still tell, he's got the psychiatrist brain or the therapy brain going, because he's telling Will Graham what he wants to know, but then he's like, your hands are rough and you smell like Old Spice and all this stuff. Like he's sitting there psychoanalyzing him, and I like crack up every time that speech comes out, because I'm like, man, like if I had been William Peterson, I wouldn't have got through a take without cracking up every time he dropped that on me, because it's just so off and out of the blue.
Even his interactions with Will Graham, it makes me understand the energy that William Peterson is going for a little bit better than, say, the rest of the film, because I can see catching Hannibal Lecter, attempting to match wits with Hannibal Lecter, attempting to get in that head to be the kind of thing that you can't let go.
Yeah, and he even says that to Crawford at one point. He's like, I couldn't ever get him out of my head, and now I got to go back and ask him again, and that's different in the book. In the book, Crawford kind of says, why don't you go and talk to Hannibal Lecter? Because he can't hurt you now. He's behind bars or whatever. And Graham like really resents that. He's like, the dude cut me in half, and you want me to go talk to him? But in this movie, though, they don't play it that way. They play it where it's his idea on the street after he beats the crap out of Stephen Lang. He's like, oh, maybe I'll go see Hannibal Lecter now. I'm like, maybe you should have a cup of coffee, chill out for a little bit before you go do that. But I don't know. There's just a lot of the strange choices that happen to sort of tell through this story and everything.
So Jay, before you move on, would you say that Hannibal Lecter is Kylie Minogue to Will Graham, because he can't get you out of my head?
I did not realize we'd be referencing that today, but yeah, we'll go with that. Maybe he's a little Carly Rae Jepsen too. Just wants to cut to the feeling, and we'll go with it.
He does say to Will Graham, "Call me, maybe." So
that is true. So. Well, to bring us back onto rail for a second, after we went aughts, tens, pop songs on everybody in the serial killer movie. What did you make of the way that Dollarhide finally loses it? And when he sees Reba with her ex-boyfriend and that whole, the misunderstanding bit or whatever, and that's just what sort of sets him off or whatever. Or let me ask you, is that what sets him off? Or has he already decided, I can't be with this woman, I've got to kill her and then go kill this new family too?
I think there was already bloodlust. I don't think he had planned on killing her that night necessarily. He, at least in his facial expressions, he looked, because when she pulled in, or when he heard that car pull in, he had this really excited expression. And whether that was he was super excited because, yay, I get to kill someone, or super excited because, yay, I get to see this girl I like, who's to say? But his mannerisms visibly changed when he saw them together. So I think maybe he did plan to kill her, but I don't know if he planned to that night.
Also didn't hurt for the fact that the guy she was with, he absolutely hated. And he already kind of set that up early.
He had a very hateable face.
Yeah, very much.
I don't feel like he had intended to kill her at all. I think that at a certain point he would have killed her, just because I think at a certain point he wouldn't be able to retain it. But it's a common behavior you see with serial killers. They get married and attempt to have a normal life, and then they just go out every once in a while and kill a prostitute or a hobo.
BTK.
Yeah. I mean, BTK, Ted Bundy had a wife and a girlfriend and a normal life. Even Jeffrey Dahmer had friends at the chocolate factory.
Yeah.
But there's just that compulsion. And I think at a certain point, it would have flared up again, no matter how happy he might have been or accepted he might have felt by Reba. And I think that just seeing, that sleazy Patrick Bateman, not Patrick Bateman, but one of the other dudes that they're comparing the business cards.
Or like the Jared Leto, Paul Allen character from American Psycho.
That's definitely, he was definitely very Paul Allen-y.
Yeah, very much. Very much. Yeah, I agree. It's neat to watch him do that facial thing, though. You're right, Lindsay, because he goes from excitement to like, confused to mad to like really disappointed. And like, it's almost like, oh, you've turned me back into the killer almost. And I don't know. I wasn't expecting that quick of a flip.
Yeah. And it did. It happened incredibly quickly. And I mean, quicker than I think it took you to even say all of the emotions that crossed his face. So the fact that he could, exhibit that full range is impressive. And also a little shocking to see him rip the upholstery off of his van.
Right. He ripped the shaggin' wagon. I couldn't believe it. Yeah.
Oh, that vinyl on the dashboard would rip pretty easily if you had a 80s fan.
I mean, that was a seriously 80s van. It had like the top deck lights and the whole nine. I mean, I think I had a Hot Wheels that sort of looked like that at one time, but yeah, this is funny to think about.
I loved that shot of his hand crawling across the dashboard like a spider.
Yeah.
And the scraping noise of his hand like on the dashboard just set my teeth on edge.
Man, and I think that's on purpose. That is supposed to now put you back on edge with this person that we've now given you reasons to like him. He took his girlfriend to pet a tiger, and then he killed the awful reporter from the Inquirer. Wouldn't we all want to do that? Maybe we don't set him on fire, but at least we'd bite their face off. And he seems to be coming around, and then you see him just totally turn. And you're like, oh shit, this is about to go south real fast, and it does. And you mentioned this word earlier, Ron, and I'm going to borrow it and say it back. Perfunctory. This ending is incredibly perfunctory. Like, it just sort of happens, and then it's like In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida, a shootout, and we're done. And I couldn't find anything about it in all the reading of the movie, but it feels like what happens at the end of a movie when they've run out of money. Like we talked about it when we did Friday the 13th Part 2, that rando scare at the end is just because they ran out of money and didn't know what else to do. And so they just did that and cut to the end. And I don't know if that's true or not, but there's something too rushed about the last showdown of this movie that just doesn't work for me. It totally unravels it for me. What do y'all think?
I agree. I think the pacing of the whole movie in general kind of felt like that. Like the first half of the movie went very slow in the sense that it felt like time was taken to develop way more than needed to be developed. And then the second half felt rushed. I preferred the second half of the movie if I had to split it down and parse it out. But yeah, that it was very Deus Ex Machina type of situation. Like, all right, we need to end this. We're at time.
One thing I can definitely say for Dino De Laurentiis is they probably didn't run out of money, because I think he could have just kept throwing. He would have just kept throwing cash at something like this until he got what he wanted. One of the things I feel about the pace, especially at the end of the movie, is that that's how kind of the whole investigation had progressed. There would be these long periods where not much was happening. They were mulling things over. He was having conversations with Dennis Farina. And then you get they would get the clue. They would find the toilet paper in the book. and that would cue into a burst of frenetic activity where they would take it to this guy, they would take it to that guy, and they would zap it with 80s lasers, and they would turn red lights on and stuff like that. And the whole thing felt like kind of lull, 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 frantic, lull, lull, lull. It's like people describe combat as a whole bunch of boredom punctuated by like 10 minutes of abject terror.
Right. And every cop will tell you the same. That's what it's like to be a real one. And this is where I would say, like, Michael Mann's adherence to, I want it to be like the real thing, doesn't give the movie a watchability. It brings the audience up, and then we're just down, and we're just down, and we're down. And then it's back up real quick. But like the pacing is weird. I know why he's doing it, but I think that's a problem.
I don't feel like Michael Mann tries to. I don't feel like Michael Mann goes after watchability. I think he tries to go for authenticity above all things.
I would agree with that statement. Yeah.
I think if you said this pacing was unwatchable, and it was difficult to watch because it was super slow and then super frantic and it felt really rushed, you would say, that's exactly what I was trying to do. You're welcome. Here's some neon.
That's also why this movie failed at the box office, though, because nobody was there. We were not in a time of the auteur filmmaker in 1986. 1976, yes. Like, this plays completely differently if you play it next to Chinatown or, the French Connection or something like that. But you play it next to 1980. You play it next to Miami Vice, and it doesn't match that energy.
But I think that's also kind of what he was going for. He wanted to do the opposite of Miami Vice. He wanted to get away from, oh, this is so cool, everything's neon, let's roll up the sleeves of our blazers kind of thing and get to something kind of dirty and unpleasant.
Lindsey, you've been unmuting and muting back and forth. I'm like,
I know. I was just thinking about what Ron was saying, and I was like, well, sometimes taking that contrarian approach does not pan out, and I don't think that panned out for him in this movie.
Yeah.
Oh, let me prove that I can make something a little darker than Miami Vice, or let me, show people that I have a bigger range. And I don't think, I mean, this was early in his career, sure. So maybe he did feel like he had something to prove, and that's fair. He's done a lot. He's had a very good career. So clearly this movie did not set him back, but it didn't work for me personally.
The thing that really gets me, and I don't know that I needed it to be too over the top, but Dollarhide kind of goes down a lot easier than I thought he would. I mean, he shoots a couple cops. One of them gets a shot into him, and Graham, who's had his face cut up a little bit at that point and is underneath the fridge that's toppled over on him, reaches for his gun through the ketchup and shoots him a few times. And you talk about some weird cuts. What in the age is all those cuts, man? Like, it's just really strange, like squib cut. I don't know if that's an artistic choice or just really shoddy editing, but that's another part that ends this is like, what just happened to him? I feel like I'm watching the end of Nighthawks, where Sylvester Stallone, spoiler alert, is blowing Rutger Hauer into the next Earth, and he shoots him twice. And then when you see Rutger Hauer, it looks like he's running through a meat grinder. It's like, how the hell did he get to that? Like, it's just a weird cut.
Okay, one of the things we could talk about at the end of the movie is that they shot the finale at the end of principal photography, and most of the crew had already left and moved on to other things. So that whole shootout in the kitchen, like, it was just people with like rubber hoses, and they would be blowing ketchup and corn syrup through the rubber hoses to simulate the squibs.
Wow.
Michael Mann himself did the bullet impacts in the kitchen by just taking glass jars and throwing them at things so they would break wherever he wanted the bullets to go. And actually, one of the things that happened was one of those broken jars flying through the air stabbed William Peterson in the thigh. Like, he had a hunk of glass stuck in his leg.
So they didn't run out of money. They just ran out of people to
basically,
do the movie.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, now that
Probably
explains
because-
so much. Yeah.
Probably because Dino had him moving on to do his next movie, and he just used the same guys. He
Yeah,
just flew them all away without telling anyone.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And there's that. Michael Mann's told the story about how he couldn't get an airline to let him shoot on it. So he just paid for everybody in the crew and the actors to do that the airline scene where Graham, the pictures fall over and that little girl sees it or whatever. And they bribed the pilots and the flight attendants with like movie set jackets and stuff like that, but they didn't tell the airline they were going to do it. They literally brought cameras on carry-ons and just shot the damn thing because they're like, well, fine, TWA, we'll show you. It's real guerrilla filmmaking. I mean, it'll get you by, but if that's the case, it works. At the end here, maybe we needed to call Dino and say, can we have 4 or 5 of those people back for a day, 2 days, something?
Also, the very shot at the end where you've got Tom Noonan dead, that's kind of alluding to the red dragon imagery that you keep going that he went on about this whole time. But during the shooting, it took so long to get the shot that Tom Noonan got stuck to the floor because of the corn syrup blood. And I just thought that was funny.
That's hilarious.
Fantastic. All this context does make me like the movie a little bit more.
But it's only the fact that you can read that and know that. Like when you watch it, right? It's like, what? That's it. Like this sort of ends. It's like,
yeah.
Oh, that's all we had. And then we go back to Florida and we got some makeup on and short shorts and Don Johnson's heartbeat, and that's it. Like that. I mean, that's a strange way to end that thing.
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of other scenes, that last one dwelled just long enough to be uncomfortable, where you're just like, why am I watching this scene? Why is it still going? And granted, the credits started rolling and that was fine. There were a lot of those where like him running down the stairs, that spiral staircase, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
When Graham was, it felt like an outtake from Family Guy.
Like an aside where they just go for it. Yeah.
Yes.
There you go. Well, we're at the part of the podcast where it's no longer time to belabor on our points. Let's talk about final thoughts, recommendations, and popcorn ratings. So what are yours for Manhunter, Ron?
I am going to give Manhunter a medium popcorn, kind of edging towards a large popcorn. I think it worked for me a lot better than it worked for you guys, at least according to some of the stuff you've been saying throughout the recording. And I can see why the stuff that doesn't work for you doesn't work for you. But I appreciate Brian Cox as Hannibal Lecter. I appreciate that like 5 minutes of screen time he gets where he makes an indelible impression. And it is the most fondly remembered part of the movie. I 100% appreciate Tom Noonan just being weird as all get out for every moment he's on screen. I appreciate the fact we get to see a lot of noteworthy actors fairly early on in their career. And I also really, I think I'm just kind of in the bag for Michael Mann's aesthetic. So even when it's a flawed like prototype version of it, of the things Michael Mann does, I still appreciate it. Like I really appreciate a lot of the sound design that they did in this movie. I appreciated, the cinematography and the use of that heavy wash lighting. I appreciate how much it tries to feel like a noir film crime movie. Like it feels like almost like a 1930s kind of melodrama gangster flick. But if you bathed it in neon and made it very sweaty. So I'm going to go with the medium popcorn. I think the stuff that holds up still holds up really well. Even 35 years after it comes on, and I can see why it's one of those movies that has grown in appreciation over the years as people kind of go back and get like Michael Mann's thing versus how they would have felt about it in 1986 when they were expecting Miami Vice and they got something much less palatable.
All right, Lindsay.
So my first reaction to this movie initially was, this is a terrible movie, and I can't believe Jay told me to watch it. And then after I watched it, I thought to myself, if I had found this movie in college, it would absolutely be one of my favorite movies because I feel like it's one of those quick cult classics that it's exactly the type of thing my friends and I would have watched over and over and over and over again in college. And I would still find it very nostalgic now. Unfortunately, I'm watching it now, but after talking with you two fine gentlemen about this, and actually, Ron, I love what you said about the noir. I think if I had watched this movie through the lens of watching a noir detective flick, I would have had a better appreciation for it when I watched it. And now I'm thinking back to it, and certain things are kind of clicking with me now that didn't yesterday when I saw it. There were a lot of things in the movie that worked really well for me. There were more that didn't. After I watched it, I was like, this is getting a small burned popcorn. Hard and flat lines, small burned popcorn for me. But I will give it, I don't know if I'm right. I don't know if I'm at the medium popcorn level quite yet, but I would at least give it a small popcorn with extra butter. I think it's just enough.
This movie borders on small medium, schmedium, I think is what I've called that in the past, or Nikki's
schmedium is good.
Yeah, schmediums. And it's schmedium because that first half really, really is poorly put together. It's interesting enough. It's when they start getting into the actual police worky stuff that it starts going like, okay, now I'm in a procedural I can follow. When we get into we meet Lecter. I love Brian Cox, echo all that, Ron. I'm with you. He's the best part of the movie. And the other best part is the Reba Dollarhide relationship thing. Like that really works. And it shouldn't. It's totally off-putting and weird, but it totally works. And that part of the movie is really interesting to me because you're watching all this sort of work out, and it's like, wow, what's this going to look like, and how's this going to be, and how's this can possibly work. And then it gets to its perfunctory ending. But you're right to call it noir because that's exactly what this is supposed to be. It's detective noir. Thomas Harris writes noir, and Red Dragon's very much a noir kind of book with sprinklings of all that psychology and stuff like that. The dichotomy of having these characters, and there's really three, and Lecter's the smallest piece of it, but you have these people that are all the same person. They're just two sides of the coin, and there's two of them that are on the other side of the law, and there's one that clearly is using his powers for good, like I said, makes the story sort of unfold and work. If the darn ending wasn't so, again, perfunctory, and now knowing that they were pulling it off with like three people and a hamburger was it's kind of amazing they got what they got out of it. But I do feel like it just sort of flatlines all of a sudden. Like this movie finally finds its footing and it gets going, and then it just drops. And I there's always parts of that I feel like, oh gosh, it could have been so much more, So I'm going to give it a medium popcorn. I think it's right there in the between. It's definitely something though that is a good watch. Like there's nothing about it that I would call boring. It just doesn't all match and work. But again, as you're describing it, Ron, maybe that's what Michael Mann was going for, was something that did not match the sensibilities of the time, or maybe what you expected. And maybe it's why it's taken it 30 through 35 years of neon murder existence to find an audience, because we're still talking about it. Other people are talking about it as well. So it was fun to revisit and chat about here. Speaking of noir films, though, coming up in September, Lindsey, you and I did a big noir flick a while back that we're going to release. We're finally breaking the Orson Welles glass here on Film Strip. We're doing the third. Yeah. We did the Third Man. So that one's coming up down the lines. And before that, though, we got our friend Anthony from Tis the Podcast on to round out August. He and I talked about Knives Out. So that's kind of a neo-noir. Rian Johnson, if people can forgive him for The Last Jedi, which you should, because that's the best one of those. But anyway, Knives Out's a lot of fun, and Anthony and I have a good time talking about it. So lots of fun stuff coming up on Film Strip. And then wrapping up September, I had a chance to talk with true crime aficionado Kelly from True Crime IRL, and we did No Country for Old Men. So we got this whole kind of crime thing going on here after coming off of Ready Player One and Rapid Fire, a couple of big summer movie type things, and leading into Ron, I guess we can go ahead and tease, is going to be a pretty epic Shocktober, I think.
Oh yeah, it's going to be a Shocktober for the ages. We have all sorts of really cool special guests, and we talk about some great movies that I'm really surprised it's taking us this long to finally get around to talk about.
Absolutely. And then we'll be back again. Lots of stuff planned out for the end of the year here, some of which is already recorded, some of which you'll have to wait to open up when it's time for presents, and we'll see where it goes. But always fun to find things here on Filmstrip. You can follow the show, filmstrippodcast.com. They'll take you to the links of all the show, and then at Filmstrip Pod is where all the social media is, and you can keep up with what's going on with the show. Share the show with other folks. Give us a 5-star review wherever you find it. And if you can't give it a 5-star review, well, just download it anyway. Download it on your mom's phone, whatever. Support independent podcasting, because we do this for fun, and the more people that interact with it, we appreciate. And hey, if you think we're all crazy and Manhunter's the greatest thing ever or the worst thing you've ever seen, let us know. Hit us up again on our socials. We'd be glad to chat with you about it and explain to you how wrong you are. No, I'm kidding. But no, we do enjoy interacting with all of you. So more to come here from Filmstrip as we go through. Ron, Linz, always good talking movies with you two, and we'll be back again soon to do more. So for Lindsey, for Ron, I'm Jay. Thank you for listening to Filmstrip.
Thank you for listening to Filmstrip. You can find more episodes on our website, filmstrippodcast.com. The Filmstrip theme music is produced and performed by Frozen Lake 121. All content used or discussed in these podcast episodes is the property of the respective owners and used under the Fair Use Act, Section 504, C2, Title 17.